Mr. Speaker, how the tables have turned, because I am proud to stand up here against arbitrary and outrageous discrimination which the status quo sees against ex-offenders. We on the affirmative team say that the biggest interest the state has in this debate is preventing recidivism, and we think the only way you can do that is to have effective rehabilitation programs which integrate people back into society. That will never happen when you continue to preclude those people from being employed, when you continue to say those people are a constant threat to society. So our model in this debate is as follows. We say employers will have no right to access your criminal history from police, nor will they have the right to ask you on job applications or in interviews or in any capacity whether or not you have previously been convicted of a crime. We secondly say that in the same way that judges right now hand down sentences that preclude you from particular paths of employment, they will continue to do that. So for example, if they punish you as a CEO for white-collar crime and say you can never be a CEO again, we think that's fine and will continue. So I'm going to bring you 2 points of substantive material. First, why these ex-offenders have a right not to be discriminated against, and secondly, why it's critical for the state to ensure ex-criminals can gain employment so as they can effectively rehabilitate those criminals. So, we say strongly on the affirmative, and in fact Eleanor herself gave us this analysis last night, that when we do allow employers to discriminate, we say it is incredibly minimal and only acceptable in the instance where it is directly linked to that particular job. So when that characteristic would be considered directly related to your ability to perform the job. So for example, in terms of physical abilities, like I can't get a job as an air hostess. But we say even in that instance, we limit that incredibly, we don't allow heaps of discretion there. We say we take a very strict line to discrimination in any form, even when it might affect your ability to perform a job. We say society is trending away from allowing even that small amount of discrimination on things like physical ability. We think that's incredibly positive, and we would like to see that continue. But let's talk about why these people don't fit into that category particularly. The first line of analysis here is that we don't think employers should be the ones deciding what the consequences of criminality are, for 3 reasons. First, we say society has said that there will be a single nexus of punishment, so courts and judges will decide one time what your punishment is that is appropriate and applicable to the crime that you committed. And that's why we don't allow double jeopardy and things as such. We think that's incredibly critical. It means that judges and courts and the criminal justice system should take that burden on and not give that burden to employers. But secondly, we say employers don't have access to expertise and knowledge about how criminals should be punished and what the appropriate punishment and level of punishment is for those criminals. And that's obviously in comparison directly to courts, who do know how best to rehabilitate those people, who do know what's in the best interest of society at large. But thirdly, and most critically, we say employers are incredibly biased actors in this particular scenario. They're unaccountable and they're unrepresentative of anyone's interests outside of their own. We think that is entirely different to that of the court structure, who takes into account what is best for individuals and what is best for society. So we think employers are not in the right position to make this decision. But secondly, we say being denied employment is a particularly large additional punishment for these individuals, and especially when it happens arbitrarily. 2 reasons why. First of all, you need to get a job to be able to access essential rights like food and like healthcare, and particularly like in places like the United States where healthcare is often linked to your ability to get a job. We say getting a job is critical for you to continue to live your life, even if you're a criminal. But secondly, it is unlikely that if you are refused from a particular path of employment or a particular job, that you can just go out and get another job. And we point you again to the United States, where the unemployment rate is so high that it is incredibly likely that you won't be able to find another job in another place of employment. We think that's incredibly problematic. But it's not just about basic things like food and healthcare. It's about what else a job provides you, which is dignity and respect and engagement with the community and a sense and a feeling like you were doing something productive with your life and that you have a future and that you're on the path to somewhere positive. We think all of those intangible benefits of jobs are incredibly critical, and they are a huge punishment when ex-offenders are incapable of getting them. But secondly, we say that the vast majority of ex-offenders are unlikely to perform their work any worse as a result of their previous offences. We say they're most often unrelated. At the very least, the risk is incredibly minimal there. But secondly on that, we say only a limited minority of crimes actually occur in the workplace. And the job of the employer isn't to hand down a sentence but to determine whether or not a person is actually a good employee. And they can do that in the same way as they do when they're hiring or testing any other employee. We think employers all the time test things like trustworthiness and reliability and a whole host of other characteristics which any employer wants out of any employee that shouldn't be specific to criminals, and it shouldn't be linked to your past criminal activity. It should be linked to you right now and your capacity to perform that job. So we say losing out on jobs is a huge double punishment for these individuals. We say employers are not the right actor to be deciding what's in the best interest of those individuals or society at large, and we think that's why the state should do it. But secondly, we think it's critical for the state to ensure that these people do have access to gainful employment. And I told you why jobs are critical then, so let's rely upon that analysis for a second. But we say the state has an interest in removing the label that says people are always going to be criminals, are always going to be a threat to society. Why? For many reasons. First, those people have a reduced incentive to not be criminal because they are already treated like they're a criminal, they are already a pariah in society, which means the potential loss for them to involve themselves in criminal activity again is incredibly minor. So one of the disincentives that operates on you re-entering a criminal path actually doesn't operate when these people are treated that way and are incapable of getting a job. But we secondly say one of the biggest incentives to not commit crime is the feeling that you're actually going to hurt someone you care about. And when society has shown that it doesn't care about you, doesn't care about your capacity to have a good life, then why are you going to feel bad about committing a crime that harms that society again? We say, again, you remove a critical incentive which would stop these people going down that path. But thirdly, we say that parole laws and all court mechanisms, when they're dealing with rehabilitation, focus critically on your ability to access support networks outside of that jail. So whether or not you have family and friends and people you can go back to so you can reintegrate into a normal life. We think that's why they give people parole, when they can prove those things. We think that is indicative of the importance that these things play in the rehabilitative process. So let's talk about why you need to be able to reintegrate. Because we say, if you are incapable of getting a job, that often means you are spiraled into poverty. We think that's incredibly problematic because if you can't get a job and you need to get money, particularly in light of all the incentives I just talked about, that makes criminality more attractive and more necessary for that individual, which again increases the likelihood that person is likely to commit that crime again. But we secondly say, because it creates a sense of stigma around you, you become isolated from society and often are only capable of interacting with people who do not judge you as a result of that ex-offence. We say those people are likely to be other ex-offenders. So to the extent that we think ex-offenders are risky, we say you should not force ex-offenders to group together because that is the only support network that they are capable of accessing. And in a really practical manner, Mr. Speaker, what this often means is that people, in order to get jobs, group together because there is one employer who is willing to hire ex-criminals, which means you have a whole host of ex-criminals working together in the same environment. We think that's incredibly problematic for the rehabilitative process. We think the state has a critical interest in making sure that A, discrimination doesn't occur arbitrarily, and that B, these people are not punished unnecessarily and more likely to reoffend. That's what the affirmative team provides you in this case.
Right, thank you very much for that speech. Now I invite the first speaker of the negative team.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Gemma may well have tried to steal my rhetoric, but she certainly engaged in a strategy that I would not have done on the affirmative, and that was to concede that continuing punishment for criminals was okay. Because when she told you that they would continue to disallow CEOs getting into positions of being another CEO, she conceded that there are circumstances where continuing punishment should be allowed. And she conceded, Mr. Speaker, that past behaviour is often a very good criteria on which to judge present and future behaviour. What we're going to tell you is that that logic actually extends to all criminal records, and it's not as specific and cannot be contained to the cases that Gemma attempted to contain it to. Two issues in rebuttal. Firstly, whether employers should be able to decide punishment, as Gemma so termed it, and secondly, whether or not getting a job is required for rehabilitation. So firstly, on what responsibility and role employers play in punishment. Firstly, we would say that employers do not have a responsibility to facilitate the rehabilitation of criminals. At a first instance, that is the responsibility of the state. But moreover, it was just a blank assertion that we think should not stand in this debate, that rehabilitation of criminals or their employers should be the main priority of employers. We don't think that is the case. Indeed, what is in their own interest is the protection of their co-workers, other employees, and their customers. And we think that criminality and past criminality is a very good criterion upon which an employer can judge the merit of that employee in regards to protecting their customers, their reputation, and their co-workers. Second response to this is that we think that this is not them sentencing these people to a further form of punishment, but it's just them actually regarding a very valid point of merit in whether that person will be a good employee in the context of their company. I'll talk about that more in my substantive. Second point of rebuttal, whether or not getting a job is required for rehabilitation. The first very low blow that Gemma tried to strike was you need a job for food and healthcare. We would support minimum standards of welfare in today's debate, and if we have to increase welfare, we're happy to do that. We don't think that's the type of thing we're talking about. Then she wanted to tell you that you need employment because it is beneficial to people's lives. We will concede that having a job is beneficial to people's lives. It is, however, not necessary for a criminal's rehabilitation. Why is that? It's because we think that where you are not hired because you are a criminal, that is largely because that criminality affects your applicability and appropriateness to be an employee for that company. But moreover, even if that wasn't the case, and even if it is just a bias towards criminals, we think that the idea that you have previously made the moral calculus that it is okay to commit a crime demonstrates that you are more likely than the rest of society to make that calculus in the future. And as I pointed to in my introduction, Gemma conceded that was the case when she said that a CEO that had in the past been deceptive was more likely to do it again, therefore we should prevent them from that form of employment. Finally, on this issue, she tried to tell you that you needed a job for dignity and respect. We think that is an abhorrent and offensive message to send to the unemployed people within our society, that they are all criminals and that they cannot have dignity because they are not employed. That's going to be Paul's substantive. But finally, she told you that only if you have a job will you have a disincentive for recidivism. We think that's a lie for a number of reasons. Firstly, the disincentive to commit further crimes exists irrespective of employment in regards to the state's punishment. But moreover, we think that the concession that you need to be in a job because otherwise you will commit a crime concedes that rehabilitation doesn't work and that we can't always trust criminals to not commit crimes. Moving on to my substantive, I'm going to talk firstly about why past criminality is a valid criterion on which to judge the merit of an employee. So firstly, I want to clarify a few things on the production of a criminal record. We think the things that we are broadly talking about are serious crimes. Why is that? Because if it's a juvenile crime, that record is expunged. If it can be suppressed by a court if they think that it is not worthwhile having that criminal record recorded, and you can also impose a conviction without note at the discretion of a judge when that conviction would not require being recorded. So we think we're talking about fairly serious crimes in today's debate. What are the types of crimes we think we're talking about? We think they are crimes against the person and crimes against property. We think on both of these cases that past behaviour is a good indication of future behaviour, because when an individual has shown in the past in their actions and been convicted for actions that violate a social calculus on what is an appropriate form of behaviour, that they are more likely than the rest of society to make that moral calculus again. It is not the burden of the negative team to tell you that every past criminal will re-offend, but it is the burden of us to tell you that they are more likely to commit crimes and that an employer has a disincentive to hire someone who is more likely to commit crimes. So why does that disincentive operate here? Let's look first at offences against the person in someone's criminal history. We think that employers have a very distinct responsibility to protect their workers and customers, and indeed they have a legal responsibility to both of those groups. We think we should prioritise the protection of those groups because they have already earned those jobs and already entered into a legal relationship with that employer, but also secondarily because they have a right to go to work and feel safe and feel that they are working in a safe work environment. Why does this proposal undermine that? Firstly, because they can't be sure that they're not working next to a criminal that has committed a serious crime, such as an assault or a violent crime against a person. But secondly, we think that even if it was the case that they worked next to a criminal under the status quo, they know that their employer would know that that person was a criminal and would be able to interpret their behaviour and treat that person differently. So for instance, if there was a sexual harassment claim in a workplace against someone that the employer knew to have been a rapist or a sexual assaulter in the past, they would take that far more seriously because they knew of that behaviour. That is a protection that we should afford co-workers and customers in today's debate. Let's look secondly at property offences. We think that the employers have an incentive to protect their assets and the perception of the integrity of their company. We think both of those things can be undermined when you hire criminals, particularly when we see people who have stolen things in the past or defrauded companies are more likely, if they have greater opportunity to do things like steal from the till or embezzle money or cook the books on their current employment, they are more likely to do that. Alright, now let's look at why employers don't have a responsibility to rehabilitate people. I've already told you that Gemma conceded that continuing punishment is actually fine in today's debate. So we think that where we restrict people's movement, restrict certain employment, they've conceded the principle that we can continue to punish individuals for past faults that they have committed. We think that what we do is when we release people is not to concede that they are totally reformed, just to concede that we don't no longer think it's fair to keep them in prison. In order to release people, we think we have to be able to place conditions upon what they do. The state, however, Mr. Speaker, engages in a significant form of rehabilitation for these people in order to facilitate reintegration. That's why we see reskilling and upskilling occurring in jail, so that they are more able to convince an employer in the future that despite of their criminal record, they have merit to be hired. We have referencing processes where their psychologists and their wardens in jail can say that they have been reformed. Those things are fine because that is rehabilitation engaged by the state. But it's not the right of the it's not the responsibility of the employer to take on the burden to rehabilitate people. Why is that? Because you do not have a right to have a job, Mr. Speaker. We think that when we require people, for instance, who have gone bankrupt in the past to declare to people they are trading with in the future that they have been bankrupt, we see that we don't have a right to economic activity just even where we have committed harms and fault in the past. We think that it is silly to say that the unemployed are criminals and that you need to have a job in order to be a functioning member of society. But as I said, Paul will talk about that later. At the end of this speech, Mr. Speaker, we think you should take away criminality is a valid merit upon which to judge whether or not you employ people. Because it is valid, because it is relevant, because employers have an interest to consider that, we're very, very proud to oppose.
Right, thank you, Speaker, for her speech. I invite the second speaker from the opposition team.
Elle said multiple times in her speech that if you're willing to commit any crime, you'll automatically make a bad employee because you'll automatically have different attitudes towards right and wrong. If that was the case, we'd never let those people out of jail, Mr. Speaker. If that was the case, those people should be permanently banned from getting those kind of jobs. But your criminality in one area of your life does not make you a bad manual labourer. It doesn't make you a bad accountant just because you previously committed a sexual offence. What it does is indicate that maybe you shouldn't be trusted around children. In my rebuttal, I'm going to talk about why that distinction is important. I'm going to be talking today about the problems of criminal escalation and gang culture, and how this is often used as a cover for racial vilification and discrimination. But let's start by talking about a couple of points for rebuttal. Firstly, in terms of why it's all right to let judges ban people from certain types of jobs, but not give employers a blanket discretion to decide whether or not they care about it. 3 reasons. Firstly, it's about who the decision should lie with, whether it should lie with the judge or with some random employer who's decided that they're not comfortable working with someone who committed a minor sexual assault 20 years ago. We think they might feel uncomfortable with it, but that doesn't mean that it's fair for that individual to be denied a job that they are perfectly capable of performing on the basis of a previous criminal history that they have shown sufficient rehabilitation from to be allowed out of jail and allowed to interact within society. So if you think that some crimes have a high recidivism rate, why give any discretion at all to those relevant employees? And the second reason why there's a distinguishing factor. So if you think it's always true that these employees are going to be unable to be trusted in jobs that don't have high levels of supervision, why not put out blanket bans from them getting any kind of job that would allow that? The reason you don't do that is because you accept that many of these people are capable of rehabilitation, are capable of reintegrating into society. But secondly, It's about whether or not an entirely unrelated employer should have any knowledge at all of an unrelated crime that you've committed in the past. So why should your employer at an accountancy firm know that when you were 18 you slept with your 14-year-old girlfriend? Why is that knowledge that that individual needs to have in order to judge whether or not you're capable of doing the maths on their accountancy books? That is entirely irrelevant. And it's why even in states where we have sex offender lists, we don't usually just release that information willy-nilly, but restrict it to relevant employee-employer relationships in things like childcare. Finally, it's about harm minimisation. The reason we're willing to accept a restriction on the rights of pedophiles to work with children is we think the risk is too high. Not that all of them are going to offend, right? Some of them may well have rehabilitated, but the harm when we get it wrong is too high. The harm when we get it wrong about whether or not someone is a petty criminal or willing to steal regularly from the stationery cupboard is not that high and is simply not that relevant. Let's then talk about whether or not this is a good way to judge people. As I've already told you, if that was the case, they shouldn't be out of jail or they should be banned from every possibly relevant job. But it's not. So Elle said we can suppress some of your criminal records. That is a substantial concession that often this is not a good indicator. And so even under the status quo where those criminal records are released to employers, we suppress large portions of them because courts decide that they are not the slightest bit relevant to those employers' decision making. So firstly, we'd say that crime is not always a product of a perfect predisposition that existed perfectly formed in you. Usually, it's because of economic desperation or coercion, or it's because of the follies of youth. And Elle conceded that when she said one of the most regular ways that we do this is for juvenile offenders. So why allow it for someone who committed a crime at 16 to have that criminal record suppressed, but not someone who was under the same kind of pressures from peer groups at the age of 18 or 19 or 21? Why is it that that distinction is drawn so perfectly in the negative team's mind? Finally, let's talk about how they're treated. Elle explicitly said that we're not just going to discriminate in terms of whether we hire them, we're also going to discriminate by effectively lowering the burden of proof when that person is accused of a workplace grievance.
Yeah.
That shows exactly the kind of attitudes we have a problem with on our side of the house. The idea that those individuals, because they have previously been violent or previously been sexually abusive, must therefore be incapable of refraining from sexual harassment and therefore should be treated more seriously than any other serious workplace grievance is ridiculous. We're proud to stand against that on our side of the house. Let's talk secondly about the problems about bipositive material. And let's start by talking about the problems of criminal escalation. Let's look at someone who is successfully rehabilitated. They were previously involved in criminal cultures. Maybe in jail, they interacted with some gangs, but they come out of jail and they want to make a new life for themselves. They want to move past their criminal history. They want to get a new job. They want to not feel like they're in fear of the police. They want to obey their parole conditions. And they say they want to move on. And then they start applying for jobs. And people start asking them, what's your criminal history? And then people start asking them to leave. And maybe they get a job, but maybe that job is nowhere near as good a job as they think they're qualified for. Maybe they're not able to use their university degree because accountancy firms won't hire them. Maybe they're not able to use other degrees or other qualifications that they have because those employers are more able to discriminate and therefore are more willing to discriminate against individuals whose crimes have no relevance to that employment. Well, what do you then do when you're that desperate or when you feel that society is never ever going to accept you, regardless of what you do or how well rehabilitated you are? You get desperate and you get upset and you get angry with the kind of society that created that culture. And so this is, in some ways, an extension of Gemma's material about the rehabilitation that these individuals go through that Elle wanted to entirely ignore. But it's also about what you do when you're in that circumstance. It's about whether or not you go back to that gang culture that you previously interacted with. It's about whether or not you're willing to commit even more extreme crimes than you already committed, because you don't see any reason not to. It's not as if jail is worse than living without a job or in a job that you have no interest in being in and that you think are far overqualified for. We think that is a really good way to ensure criminal escalation. But that's particularly true, and this brings me to my second point for a particular group. And I want to talk about racial vilification in the United States, because we think the United States is the country that is most willing to do things like release criminal records. So employers often do ask and investigate previous criminal history. But overwhelmingly, those requests are made disproportionately towards African Americans and Latino populations. They're made towards individuals who those employers already have discriminatory feelings about. And sometimes that's explicitly. Sometimes they're looking for a reason not to hire that person. Sometimes they're simply trying to avoid the fact that they don't want to work with a black person. But more often it's subconscious. They think it's likely that those people are likely to be criminal. They buy into Elle's rhetoric once a criminal, always a criminal, and there's no way we should hire that individual. But the problem that creates is that young African Americans with minor drug offences are treated differently from young white Americans with minor drug offences. And that's not just in society, that's in their employment, and it's in their capacity to move on from what was often just a troubled childhood. And it's why the United States actually has some quite good suppression of criminal record laws, because they realised that this was happening and tried to deal with it. But why should that only be the case for a juvenile offender? Why should that only be the case for a minor offender and not someone who's equally rehabilitated and equally capable of moving on in their lives? What you do is permanently block those individuals from moving on to their past, and particularly for African American and Latino communities in the US. We see a cycle of poverty, desperation, and further and escalating crime because your capacity to move on from one crime in your childhood is drastically reduced when you're interacting with individuals who are already racist and are looking for an excuse not to hire you. It's not easy to stand on the side of criminals in a debate, but it is really easy to stand on the side of rehabilitating criminals who want to move on with their lives, want to access jobs, are capable of doing those jobs, and are denied that for no reason other than bias of individuals. That's why we allow courts to make the decision and not employers, and that's why we're proud to stand on this side of the House.
Right, thank you very much for that speech. We now invite the second speaker of the negative team.
Mr. Speaker, in today's debate, the negative team did not say that people that have committed a crime will automatically re-offend. What we said was that they were disproportionately more likely to commit another offence, and that is a fair factor for employers to take into account when they decide whether or not to hire them. So it is not arbitrary that they don't want to hire criminals, because crime is a choice, as we've told you in today's debate, and that these people have decreased their own chances of getting a job. Let's look at two things in rebuttal. Firstly, the principle about whether or not the criminal record is relevant, and secondly, material about rehabilitation and gangs. So firstly, whether or not the criminal record is a relevant consideration. And we heard the assertion from them that there is no nexus between the crimes that they committed in the past and the crimes that they might commit in future. That the crimes originally wouldn't have even happened in the workplace, so how could it possibly make them a bad employee? We think that the qualities that lead you to commit a crime preclude you from a range of jobs that is very broad, not narrow. That even if you committed a crime outside of the workplace, this indicates that you would be more likely to commit one in the workplace. Why is that? Firstly, because you have shown a disregard of general societal good in favour of your own greed, for example, in the case of fraud. You have shown certain personal qualities like deceit, or like violence in the case of sexual offences. And we think that whether or not you're working in a retail store or a CEO or any of the rest of it, those qualities are going to mean that you're more likely to commit an offence, and there's nothing about the fact that you're in paid employment that makes that any less likely. Because most of those crimes are committed regardless of money. That you can commit, that you can be a rapist or a violent person regardless of whether or not you're employed. And to the extent that some of them are linked to money, in that poverty might make you more likely to commit crimes of stealing property, we don't think poverty is an excuse, because in states with welfare, we think even the poor have a choice not to be criminals. So because we think that these are relevant considerations, that past behaviour is indicative of future behaviour, we don't think that this is a case of the employees deciding the punishment, but rather protecting their own interests in not choosing to take people on that are disproportionately likely to harm the business, to harm customers, or to harm fellow co-workers. But further responses to this idea that employers should not decide the punishment are firstly, that we don't think that not having a job is a punishment, because the court is not sentencing you to not have a job. They are just giving society the truth, which might make it less likely that you have a job. And plenty of people don't have jobs in society, and that is not like a form of punishment as a result of their behaviour. Secondly, we would say it is not the employer that is deciding the punishment. It is judges and courts that decide whether or not you get a criminal record. And Elle gave you the example of the fact that you can be found guilty but no conviction recorded. And so we think that it is the judges and courts that are ones that are exercising the discretion about whether society should fear you and whether or not that stigma should exist. So what did Maddie say in response to this? we think that all that she was able to say was that these crimes were irrelevant. Well, we think that to the extent that there might be crimes in your past that are less relevant to indicate future behaviour, we think that employers are able to weigh that up. So if you committed a crime when you were very young, and then you have lived an exemplary life since then, we think that employers will be very likely to overlook that criminal record and the harm is just not there. We think that if the crime was, statutory rape when you were young and you're now trying to become an accountant, maybe it is relevant because it shows that you're not very good at maths. But we think that if there were crimes that were completely irrelevant to jobs, we think those would be the ones that employers would be most likely to overlook, and that the harms to those people are therefore minimal. But what we never heard a response to was the material about why this is disproportionately harming the co-workers in this situation. Second issue I want to look at in rebuttal is rehabilitation. And Maddie largely repeated the analysis of the first speaker, that when people are alienated, they might go back to crime. We would say that the message that there is a higher probability you'll commit a crime if you already have committed one is rational, so that stigma is not disproportional. Secondly, we would say that people don't become criminals to spite social messages. All the benefits of not reoffending, like reintegrating in society, will still exist regardless of whether or not you tell people the truth, that people are more likely to reoffend if they are a criminal. But thirdly, let's look at what this says to people who might go back to crime anyway. The message is that society expects that of you, that it's okay because poverty might have forced you into that crime to begin with. That's unacceptable. Lastly, minorities. We think that, I'll rebut this in my substantive material now actually, as I move to what this does to the hiring of minorities. And we think that there are certain minorities that have a higher proportion of criminals than the general population, like African Americans and like Latinos in LA. We think that employers tend to judge those people as a class, as an ethnic group. And we've seen this in the fact that African Americans, even with identical CVs, do better if they take out the black elements of their name and give them a more racial neutral name. We think in the absence of information about people's actual past and their actual criminal record, we think that employers are more likely to treat people as members of that class rather than on their individual merits and on whether they are individually criminals or not. We think that that has a massive harm on minorities because there are plenty of people that are part of these minorities like African Americans and Latinos that are not criminals. And those people without criminal records are more likely to be judged as criminals under the affirmative team's model when an employer cannot distinguish them from someone who has actually committed a crime. And we think that all of Maddie's material about the disproportionate stigma against black and white criminals is actually solved by the negative team because we think employers will treat black and white criminals the same when they can see which ones are criminals. So we think that they are likely then to not be hiring white criminals under our case, and we think that they are likely to be hiring members of minorities that don't have criminal records, and that has benefits to them in terms of decreasing racial tension and increasing their economic opportunity. The second argument I want to bring in this debate is about what this does for unemployed people. And I want to look at the link between, what both teams say about the link between unemployment and crime. Our case clearly says that crimes are a choice. That even if you're unemployed and poor, that does not excuse crimes against property because we have welfare because you don't have to steal to eat in the first world. And we say that crimes against people definitely don't have an excuse because, rape and assault are not excused by poverty. The affirmative team's message, on the other hand, by saying that you need to keep a job in order to prevent committing a future crime, because it's so integral to rehabilitation. We think the message that they send is that unemployment and criminals, that unemployed people are more likely to commit crimes. We think that that has an incredibly detrimental effect on people that are unemployed that are not criminals, because it has the effect of demonising them. It lumps them in with people that have actually committed crimes and treats them as potential criminals. It says to future potential employers that unemployed people are unstable or untrustworthy rather than just unlucky. And we think that perpetuates economic and social harm in including unemployed people in the future because of the message that sends. So, to conclude this speech, because we think that past behaviour is indicative of future behaviour, particularly when you have broken society's laws, when you've displayed characteristics that, such as violence and deceitfulness and a disregard for punishment, we think that that is likely to manifest itself in the workplace, that employers then are justified in using that information to protect their business, their customers and their co-workers. And we think that it is not an arbitrary form of discrimination, it is entirely rational, and therefore we beg to oppose.
Right, thank you, speaker, for your speech.